My name is Rachel Monroe. I am 31 years old and I plan events for a living. Corporate conferences, charity galas, product launches for companies whose names you would recognize. I have coordinated a black tie dinner for 400 people in a venue that lost power at 6:45 in the evening and was fully operational by 7:15. I have rerouted a wedding ceremony around a burst pipe 40 minutes before the guests arrived. I have, on one memorable occasion, sourced a replacement wedding cake from 3 different bakeries in 90 minutes because the original was dropped in a parking lot. What I'm telling you is that I'm not someone who panics. I'm someone who makes a phone call. So when I found out, 3 weeks before my wedding, that my future mother-in-law had quietly removed 11 of my closest friends from the guest list and replaced them with people I had met a combined total of 4 times in my life, I did not cry. I did not confront her. I did not call Daniel and demand he choose a side. I opened my laptop, pulled up the venue contract, and made one phone call that Linda Mercer would spend the rest of her life thinking about every single time she drove past an empty parking lot. Welcome back to the empty chair, where the women who were always expected to smile and accommodate finally tell the whole story. If you have ever had someone rearrange your life while your back was turned and call it helping, this one is for you. Subscribe and drop a comment below, because what happened on my wedding day is something I could not have planned better if I had tried. And I'm a professional planner, but I need to start at the beginning, because the phone call only makes sense if you understand the 8 months that came before it. 8 months of a woman who smiled at everything I said, and agreed with everything I proposed, and then went home and did exactly what she had always intended to do, and counted on the fact that I was too busy, too trusting, and too in love with her son to look closely enough to notice. I met Daniel at a corporate event I coordinated 3 years ago. He was the keynote speaker's assistant, which meant he spent most of the evening being quietly competent in the background while everyone else was loud in the foreground. And I noticed him because quiet competence at an event is something I have enormous professional respect for. We talked for 40 minutes near the coat check after the dinner wound down. He was kind and specific and funny in a way that did not announce itself, and I drove home thinking about him in the particular way you think about someone when you already know you're going to think about them for a long time. We had been together for 14 months when he proposed. A Tuesday night in his kitchen while he was making pasta, which is exactly the kind of proposal Daniel would make and exactly the kind I would want. No performance. No audience. Just the two of us and a question he had clearly been thinking about for longer than he let on. I said yes before he finished the sentence. Daniel's mother, Linda, called 40 minutes later. I do not know how she knew so quickly because Daniel and I had not told anyone yet, but Linda has always had a particular sensitivity to events in her son's life that I have never been able to fully account for. She was warm on the phone, genuinely warm, I believe. She said she was thrilled, that she had known I was the right one from the moment she met me, that she wanted to be involved in the planning in whatever way I needed. She used the phrase "whatever you need" 3 times in a 4-minute phone call, which I noted, and did not examine as closely as I should have. I want to be honest about something before I go any further. Linda is not a villain in the way that word usually gets used. She is not cruel. She does not raise her voice or say cutting things or deliver obvious ultimatums. What she does is something quieter and in many ways more effective. She volunteers for things. She offers to help. She inserts herself into the planning and the logistics and the details with such relentless warmth and such an air of selfless assistance that by the time you realize the thing has been rearranged according to her specifications, she has been thanking you for the opportunity to be involved for 3 weeks, and it feels churlish to point out that the outcome looks nothing like what you originally described. I had seen this operate in smaller ways in the 14 months before the engagement. The Christmas dinner that was supposed to be at our apartment and ended up at her house because she had already ordered the turkey before we confirmed the plan. The birthday celebration for Daniel that was supposed to be just the 2 of us and became a family dinner of 12 because she had mentioned it to his aunts and they had been so excited. Each individual instance was deniable. Each one arrived packaged in warmth and good intentions. The pattern only became visible at scale, and by the time the scale was my wedding, I had not yet learned to read it clearly enough. I planned events for a living, which meant I had opinions about every aspect of our wedding and the organizational capacity to execute all of them. The venue I chose was a restored farmhouse 30 minutes outside Austin, the kind of place with exposed wooden beams and string lights and a ceremony space under a stand of old live oak trees. I had worked an event there 2 years earlier and fallen in love with it. When Daniel and I toured it together, he looked at me looking at it and said, "Book it," before I could finish my sentence, which is one of the reasons I was marrying him. The guest list was something I had thought about carefully. We had agreed on 120 people total. My side, my parents, my brother and his wife, my grandmother, 11 close friends from various chapters of my life, and a selection of colleagues I genuinely liked. Daniel's side was structured similarly. It was a balanced list. It was our list. I typed it up in a spreadsheet with dietary restrictions and plus ones and table groupings, and I was proud of it in the specific way you are proud of a thing you have built with care. Linda offered to help with a seating chart in month 3 of planning. She said she knew Daniel's extended family better than anyone and could make sure the table groupings made sense for his side. This was reasonable. I sent her the spreadsheet. I want you to understand that I sent her the whole spreadsheet. Not just Daniel's side, because she had offered to help with the seating and I trusted her with the full picture. I should have sent her half the picture. For 6 weeks, nothing seemed wrong. Linda sent occasional emails about seating suggestions, all of them reasonable, all of them minor. She came to the cake tasting and had thoughtful opinions. She attended the venue walkthrough and asked good questions. She was, by every visible measure, doing exactly what she said she was doing, which was helping. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday evening in October, when my best friend Jess called me from her car. Jess and I have been friends since we were 19, which means she has been my friend through 2 other serious relationships, a career change, a cross-country move, and the specific chaos of my late 20s. She was the first person I had called after Daniel proposed. She was going to be my maid of honor. Her name was at the top of my spreadsheet. She called to ask if everything was okay with us. Her voice careful in the way voices get when someone is preparing to say something they are not sure will land well. I told her, of course, why would anything not be okay? She said she had not received a save the date. I told her they had gone out 3 weeks ago. She said she had not received one. I said I would check the address and resend. I checked the address. It was correct. I had sent it myself, from my own account, to the list I had compiled. Jess's name was on that list. Her save the date had been sent. I called the paper goods company I had used for the physical save the dates. They had printed and mailed according to the address list they were given. The address list they were given, not the list I had sent them originally. A revised list, submitted 3 weeks after my original, from an email address I recognized as Linda's. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after that call. I pulled up the original spreadsheet and the revised one side by side. It took me 22 minutes to map the differences completely, because I'm thorough when I'm looking for something I do not want to find. 11 names removed from my side. 11 names I had chosen. Jess. My college roommate Kara. My friend Priya, who had flown in from London for my 30th birthday. 7 others who had been present at the moments of my life that mattered most. All of them replaced with names on Daniel's family's extended network. People I had met at holiday gatherings and remembered vaguely. People whose presence at my wedding would be meaningful to Linda and largely decorative to me. She had not edited Daniel's side at all. Not one name. Just mine. I closed the laptop, I went to the kitchen and made tea, which is what I do when I need my hands to be doing something so my brain can work without interference. I stood at the counter and I drank the tea and I thought about the 8 months of warmth and offered assistance, and I understood, clearly and completely, what the pattern actually was. Linda did not want to help plan my wedding. Linda wanted to plan Daniel's wedding. The distinction was everything, and I had handed her the tools to act on it by trusting her with my spreadsheet. I thought about what to do for a long time, not because I was uncertain about what I wanted the outcome to be, but because I wanted to be sure the path I chose was one I could stand behind, not just in the heat of the discovery, but in a year, in 5 years, in the decades of family dinners and holidays that were going to follow this wedding regardless of how it went. I thought about confronting her directly. I played the conversation out in my head and I knew exactly how it would go, because I had been watching Linda operate for 8 months and I understood her toolkit. She would be warm and confused. She would explain that she had been trying to help. She would say she thought I had too many people on my side and she was trying to balance the room. She would be so genuinely distressed at my distress that within 40 minutes I would be the one apologizing for upsetting her. And nothing would have changed except that she would be more careful about the evidence she left behind next time. I thought about telling Daniel. I was going to tell Daniel, and I did tell Daniel, but not that night, because telling Daniel meant asking him to navigate a confrontation with his mother 3 weeks before our wedding, and I loved him enough to not want that to be his primary memory of the week before we got married. What I did that night after the tea, after the thinking, was pull up the venue contract on my laptop. I read it carefully, which is a habit I have from years of being the person who has to execute what the contract describes. I noted the amendment clause, the force majeure language, the change of date and change of location provisions. Then I called my contact at the farmhouse, a woman named Susan who had worked with me on the event 2 years earlier, and I left a message asking her to call me first thing in the morning about a potential amendment to our booking. I slept better than I expected to. I think because the decision was already made, and once a decision is made, the anxiety that surrounds it has nowhere left to live. I lay in bed in the quiet of my apartment, and I thought about Jess, who had not received a save the date to my wedding. I thought about Priya, who was going to find out the same way. I thought about the 11 women whose names had been quietly lifted off a list they belonged on, and I thought about the person who had done it and called it helping. Then I thought about the phone call I was going to make in the morning, and I closed my eyes, and I slept. Susan called at 8:15. I told her I needed to discuss moving the event to a different date and potentially a different location. And before she could respond with a standard "this will be complicated" energy that venue coordinators deploy when change requests arrive, I told her I was a professional event coordinator who understood the logistical implications and I had already identified a backup venue and I simply needed to know what our contractual options were. She appreciated the directness. We talked for 40 minutes. By the time we hung up, I had a plan. I had a very good plan. The new venue was a property I had used twice before for corporate events. A converted warehouse in East Austin with better acoustics, a larger outdoor space, and a catering team I trusted more than the one at the farmhouse. The date was the same. The setup would be more work, but I had 3 weeks and I was a professional, and 3 weeks was enough. I called the new venue before 9 in the morning and had a preliminary hold on the space by 10. Then I did something that required the specific kind of patience that I have spent my entire career developing. I did nothing visible. I did not call Linda. I did not email her. I did not mention the amended save the dates or the revised spreadsheet or the 11 names that had been quietly erased. I went about my week as though everything was proceeding exactly as planned, which in a sense it was, just not according to the plan Linda thought she had secured. I called each of my 11 friends personally. Not to explain everything, not yet, but to get their addresses confirmed, to tell them there had been a mailing error and new invitations were coming, to make sure they knew they were expected and wanted, and that their seat at my wedding was never in question. Jess cried a little on the phone. I told her I would explain everything after and that the wedding was going to be exactly what it was supposed to be. I meant both of those things completely. I told Daniel on a Thursday night, 10 days before the wedding. I showed him the 2 spreadsheets side by side. I showed him the email chain with the paper goods company. I showed him Linda's email address in the submission header. I watched him go through the stages of it. The confusion, the checking for an alternative explanation, the slow and reluctant arrival at the only conclusion the evidence supported. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What do you need me to do?" That is, I want to be clear, one of the reasons I married him. I told him what I had already done. The new venue, the calls to my friends, the plan for the following 10 days. He listened to all of it without interrupting, which is something he is very good at. And when I finished, he asked one question. "Does my mother know about the venue change?" I told him she did not. He nodded slowly. He asked if I wanted her to know before the wedding. I thought about it for exactly 4 seconds. I said no. He nodded again. He reached across the table and took my hand. He said, "I'm sorry she did this." I said, "I know." Then we finished dinner and we talked about other things, and the subject of Linda did not come up again until the morning of our wedding, when she pulled into the parking lot of the farmhouse at 10:45 in her good coat and her church shoes, 45 minutes before a ceremony that was taking place 30 minutes away, and found nothing there but an empty building and a handwritten note I had taped to the front door. I want to tell you what that note said. But first I want to tell you about the 10 days between Thursday and the wedding morning, because those 10 days are where the real work happened and I think they deserve to be described accurately. The logistics of moving a wedding venue 10 days out are not simple even when you are a professional event coordinator. They are, however, survivable, which is something I knew going in and which turned out to be true. The new venue required a modified floor plan, which I drew up on Friday. The catering team needed a revised timeline, which I sent Saturday morning. The florist, who I had worked with before, and who was one of the most unflappable people I have ever met professionally, said, "Give me the new address and I will be there." And she was. The officiant, a friend of mine who had gotten ordained specifically for our wedding, said the location does not matter. The words are the same anywhere, which is exactly the kind of thing she would say. What required the most delicate handling was the invitation situation. The original invitations had gone to Linda's revised list, which meant the people who were supposed to be at my wedding had not received formal invitations and the people Linda had substituted had. I could not send a mass correction without explaining why, and I was not ready to have that explanation become general knowledge before the wedding day. So I handled it the way I handle every sensitive logistical situation, individually, personally, with a phone call rather than an email. I called each of my 11 friends and I gave them the new venue details, and I told them there had been an administrative error with the original invitations and everything was sorted now. I told them their presence was important to me, and I could not imagine the day without them. I did not explain the nature of the administrative error, because that conversation would take longer than I had, and because some of it was still Daniel's story to navigate with his family in his own time. What I gave each of them was a confirmed time, a confirmed address, and the knowledge that their seat had never actually been in question. For Linda's substitutes, the ones who had received invitations to a wedding they now would not be attending, I had Daniel handle the calls. He was gracious and brief and told them there had been a venue change and due to capacity constraints, the guest count had been adjusted. It was not a full explanation, it was enough. None of them were people who would be significantly harmed by missing our wedding, because none of them were people who had any real stake in it. They had been invited to fill seats at someone else's vision of an event. The seats were being unfilled. The one call I did not make was to Linda. I thought about it more than once in those 10 days. I thought about calling her and telling her what I knew and giving her the opportunity to account for herself. I thought about what she would say and how the conversation would go and whether there was any version of it that ended somewhere useful. I kept arriving at the same conclusion. There was no version of that conversation that served my wedding. There might be a version that served our relationship going forward, and I was willing to have it. But not before the ceremony, and not at the cost of the 10 days I needed to spend making sure the day itself was what it was supposed to be. So I did not call Linda. I sent her a reminder about the ceremony time and the parking situation at the venue, using the farmhouse address that was on the original booking. The one she believed was still the active venue. And I did it with the specific calm of someone who has made a decision and is no longer second-guessing it. I want to be honest about something. There was a part of me, not the professional part and not the part that had spent 10 days rebuilding a wedding logistics structure from the ground up, but a smaller and more human part that was aware of what Linda was going to experience when she pulled into that parking lot. I'm not someone who takes pleasure in other people's distress as a general principle. I thought about it. I sat with it. I asked myself whether what I was doing was proportionate. And then I thought about Jess calling me from her car, her voice careful and confused, asking if everything was okay between us. I thought about Priya, who I had called on a Wednesday morning and who had gone very quiet on the phone when I told her there had been an error. Quiet in the way people go quiet when they have already been privately wondering if they had done something wrong. I thought about 11 women whose names had been lifted off a list by someone who had decided her vision of the guest list was more important than mine, at my own wedding, and who had counted on the fact that I was too trusting or too busy or too in love to look closely enough to catch it. The parking lot, I decided, was proportionate. Daniel told his mother the ceremony time was 11:30. It was actually 11. The photographer arrived at 9. My mother arrived at 9:15 and cried when she saw the venue and said it was more beautiful than the farmhouse, which was generous of her and also true. Jess arrived at 9:45 and hugged me for a long time without saying anything, and when she pulled back her eyes were bright and she said, "You look exactly like yourself," which is the best thing anyone has ever said to me about my appearance. The guests filled in through the morning. The right ones. The ones whose names had been on my original list. The people who had been present at the chapters of my life that built me into the person who was standing in a converted warehouse in East Austin in a dress I had found on the third try and loved immediately. My grandmother sat in the front row with her hands folded in her lap and watched everything with the attentive calm of a woman who has attended many weddings and knows that the ones worth remembering are not always the most elaborate ones. At 10:42, my phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. It said, "She just called me. She's at the farmhouse. There's no one there." I texted back, "I know." He sent back a single word, "Ready?" I looked around the room. I looked at Jess, who was straightening her bouquet. I looked at my parents, who were talking to Daniel's father, a quiet man I liked enormously, who had known about the venue change since Thursday and had said only that he thought Daniel had made a good choice in me, which I took as the whole of his position on the matter. I looked at the live oak branches someone had brought in from a nursery and arranged along the ceremony aisle. I looked at the string lights that the venue team had stayed late the previous night to hang. I looked at the empty chair at the end of the front row with a small white card on it that said, "Reserved," which I had placed there myself, which was not reserved for anyone at all, which was there because I believe that the spaces left by people who chose to rearrange your life instead of simply showing up for it deserve to be acknowledged. I texted Daniel back. I said, "I have been ready for 8 months." And I put my phone away and I picked up my bouquet and I walked toward the door where my father was waiting to walk me in, and I did not think about the parking lot again until after we had said our vows and signed the license and danced to the song we had chosen together, and by then it had already become the story I'm telling you now. The note I taped to the front door of the farmhouse said 4 sentences. I wrote it on a piece of cream cardstock from the same stationery set I had used for the wedding programs. I wrote it by hand because I wanted it to be legible and personal and unambiguous, and because I have found over the years that handwritten things land differently than printed ones. They suggest effort. They suggest that the person who wrote them chose to. The note said, "The ceremony has been moved to a new location." The guest list has also been revised. Daniel and I are married as of 11 o'clock this morning. We wish you well. I had written 3 different versions before I settled on that one. The first was longer and included more explanation. The second was shorter and felt too cold even by my standards. The third, the one I taped to the door, said exactly what needed to be said and nothing that did not. I have always believed that the most effective communication is the kind that leaves the other person with nothing to argue against. Because you have not argued. You have simply stated what is true. Linda called Daniel at 11:47, which was 9 minutes after we were pronounced married and approximately 3 minutes after the photographer captured the moment Daniel's face did the thing I have loved watching his face do since the coat check at that corporate event 2 years ago. Daniel's phone was in his jacket pocket and he did not answer it. He answered it an hour later, during the cocktail hour, stepping outside to the venue's small courtyard, while I talked to my grandmother and watched Jess and Priya discover they had a mutual friend from different chapters of their lives and immediately become co-conspirators in the corner. I'm going to tell you what Daniel told me Linda said on that call, because he came back from the courtyard and found me immediately and told me everything, which is the kind of husband he has always been in the 9 months since our wedding. He does not manage my information. He does not decide what I can handle. He tells me things and trusts me to handle them, which I always do. Linda had driven to the farmhouse in her good coat and her church shoes and found the parking lot empty and the building dark and the note on the front door. She had read the note. She had stood in that parking lot for a period of time she did not specify. Then she had called Daniel. She was not screaming on the phone. Linda does not scream. She was, Daniel said, using a voice he had heard only a few times in his life. A voice below her usual register, controlled in the way things are controlled when the controlling itself is the message. She said, "What did you do?" Daniel said, "We moved the wedding, Mom." She said, "You moved it without telling me." He said, "Yes." She said, "Your own mother was not at your wedding." He said, "My own mother removed 11 of Rachel's friends from the guest list and replaced them with her own choices. And Rachel found out, and we made a decision together about how to handle it." There was a silence on the line. Daniel said it was the kind of silence that has weight and texture. Not the silence of someone who has nothing to say, but the silence of someone deciding very carefully what to say next. Linda said, "I was trying to help. The guest list was unbalanced, and I was trying to make it work better for everyone." Daniel said, "It was Rachel's wedding too, Mom. Her friends belonged on that list." Linda said, "I am your mother. I have been planning for this day since you were born. I had a right to be there." Daniel said, "You had an invitation. The address on it was the one you sent the save the dates from." Another silence. Then Linda said the thing that I think about sometimes when I'm trying to understand the particular architecture of her thinking. She said, "You chose her over your own family." Daniel said, "I chose my wife at my wedding. That is not a choice. That is the definition of the event." And then he said he had to get back inside because the cocktail hour was starting. And he ended the call, and he came back to where I was standing and told me everything. And then he took a glass of champagne from a passing tray and handed it to me, and we stood together in the East Austin sunshine, and I thought about the empty chair at the end of the front row with the small white card on it, and I felt, for the first time in 8 months, completely at ease. The reception was everything I had wanted it to be. Not because everything went perfectly, because a few things did not. The first song for our first dance started 30 seconds late because the playlist shuffled unexpectedly. One of the caterers mixed up 2 dietary requests for a few minutes before it was sorted. My cousin gave a toast that was 11 minutes long when I had asked for 5, but it was funny and warm and I did not mind. These are the things that happen at weddings and that become the texture of the memory rather than the damage to it. What I remember most is the room. Not the decor, though the decor was exactly right. The room as in the people in it. Jess at the table nearest the dance floor, laughing at something my brother said. Priya with her camera out, not the photographer's camera but her own, taking the kind of candid photographs that end up being the ones you actually keep. My grandmother, who had been awake since 5 in the morning because she always wakes up early when something important is happening, holding court at the head of her table with 2 of Daniel's aunts who had known nothing about any of the preceding events, and had simply shown up to celebrate their nephew, and found themselves charmed by an 81-year-old woman with strong opinions about wedding cake. Daniel's father sat beside Daniel's uncle for most of the reception, and I watched them talking in the comfortable shorthand of men who have known each other for decades. And at one point, Daniel's father caught my eye across the room and raised his glass slightly, a small private toast, and I raised mine back, and that was the whole of the conversation we needed to have about everything that had happened. Linda did not come to the reception. I had not expected her to, and I had not wanted her to, and I want to be honest about that because I think pretending otherwise would not serve the story or anyone reading it. I did not want the woman who had spent 8 months positioning herself as my helper while quietly dismantling my choices to be in the room where I married her son. I wanted the people there who had shown up because they wanted to see me happy, not because they had orchestrated their own invitation. There was one moment in the late afternoon, around the time the wedding cake was being cut, when Daniel went quiet for a minute and I knew he was thinking about her. I did not say anything because there was nothing to say that would resolve it, and because I knew that whatever grief he was carrying about his mother and that parking lot was his to process in his own time, and I was not going to rush it or minimize it. When he came back from wherever he had gone in his own head, he looked at me and said, "I love you." I said, "I know." Then we cut the cake, and he gave me the first piece, and I gave him the second, and the photographer caught it, and it is one of my favorite photographs from the entire day. The aftermath of a decision like the one I made does not resolve cleanly or quickly, and I want to be clear about that because I think stories like this one can sometimes suggest that the satisfying moment is also the ending, and that is rarely how it works in real life. The satisfying moment was the note on the door. The real work started after the honeymoon. Daniel talked to his mother 3 days after we got back. He went to her house alone, which was the right call, and his call to make, and they talked for 2 hours. He came home quieter than he left. He told me Linda had maintained throughout that she had been helping, that her intentions were good, that she did not understand why what she had done was different in kind from any other logistical adjustment a mother might make to ensure a family event went well. She had used the phrase family event, he said, which told me something important about the gap between her understanding of our wedding and mine. Daniel told her clearly and without ambiguity that what she had done was not acceptable and that he supported my response entirely. He told her that if she wanted a relationship with us going forward, it would require an actual apology to me, not an explanation of her intentions, but an acknowledgement that what she did was wrong and that it caused harm. He said it calmly, and he said it once, and he did not revisit it, because Daniel knows that repeating yourself in these conversations is an invitation to negotiate terms that should not be negotiable. Linda called me 6 weeks after the wedding. She asked if we could have lunch. I said yes, because I had always been willing to have the conversation. I had just needed it to happen after, and not before. And because Daniel's relationship with his mother was something I cared about for his sake, even when I found her difficult for my own. We had lunch at a restaurant she chose, which was fine, and she talked for most of it about how much the day had meant to her in concept even though she had not been there, which was a complicated thing to say and which I let pass without comment. Near the end of lunch she said, "I think we both made mistakes in how this was handled." I had been waiting to hear what she was going to offer as her version of an apology, and that sentence told me the whole of it. Both. We both, the grammar of people who will acknowledge that something went wrong only if the wrongness can be distributed. I looked at her across the restaurant table and I thought about Jess's voice on the phone, careful and uncertain, asking if everything was okay between us. I thought about 11 names quietly lifted off a list. I thought about a parking lot and a note on a door and an empty chair with a small white card. I said, "I think we see this differently, Linda, and I'm not sure that is something we are going to resolve over lunch, but I want you to know that I am committed to having a functional relationship with you, because you are Daniel's mother and I love Daniel. I think that is a place we can both start from." She nodded. She looked like she had expected more and was deciding whether to push for it. She decided not to. That was, I thought, a reasonable decision. We have a functional relationship now. It is not warm, not in the way I would have wanted it to be before I understood what warmth from Linda actually meant. But it is civil. She comes to holidays. She asks about my work, and I ask about hers. She has learned, I believe, that I am someone who reads contracts carefully and makes phone calls when necessary, and that knowledge has changed the way she operates around me in ways that I find acceptable. Daniel and I bought a house last spring. A small one with a big backyard and an office for me, with good north-facing light. On the wall of that office I have a framed photograph from the wedding, not the formal portraits. But one Priya took on her camera of me and Jess and 3 other women from my original list standing in the courtyard with our shoes off in the afternoon sun, laughing at something someone had just said. I cannot remember what it was. It does not matter. What matters is the room full of people who were supposed to be there. Were there? The empty chair in the front row stayed empty for the whole ceremony. I did not plan anything dramatic around it. I did not draw attention to it or explain it to anyone who asked. It was simply a chair, at the end of the front row, with a small white card that said reserved. A placeholder for the space between what someone tried to make my wedding and what it actually was. After the ceremony was over and the cocktail hour began, Jess found me in the bridal suite and asked what the chair was for. I told her it was for everyone who tried to rearrange the guest list. She looked at me for a second and then she laughed. The real laugh, the one I have known since we were 19. She said, "You are the most organized person I have ever met." I said, "I know." I put my shoes back on and we went to join the party. If someone in your life has been quietly rearranging things and calling it help, hear this. You are allowed to read the contract. You are allowed to check the spreadsheet. You are allowed to make one phone call and change the entire address. The people who belong at your table will find their way there. The ones who tried to choose for you can find the note on the door. Drop one word in the comments that describes how this story made you feel. I read every single one. Share this with someone who needed to hear it today. Hit subscribe and I will see you in the next one. I want to go back to something I skimmed past because I think it deserves more than a sentence. I want to tell you about the 10 days between discovering what Linda had done and the morning of the wedding, because those 10 days are the part of this story that I'm actually most proud of. And they have nothing to do with the parking lot or the note on the door. They have to do with the 11 phone calls. Each one was different, because each of those women is different and my relationship with each of them is different, and the specific texture of what had almost happened to them was different for each one. Jess was the first, because she was the one who had called me. She was also the hardest, because she is my oldest friend, and because the particular hurt of almost being erased from my wedding is something I could hear in her voice even when she was trying not to let me hear it. I told her everything. Not the version I told the others, the administrative error version, but the actual version, because Jess has earned the actual version of everything that happens in my life. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things she is best at, and when I finished she said, "What are you going to do?" I told her. She said good. That was it. That was the whole of her response, and it was exactly right. Priya was the second call. Priya lives in London now, which meant the call went at 7 in the morning my time, and she was already 2 hours into her workday when I reached her. She had noticed she had not received anything. She had not said anything because she did not want to make an awkward situation for me, which is Priya exactly, always protecting other people from the awkwardness that other people have created. I told her she was on the list and she was coming and I would send the new details within the week. She said, "Rachel, are you okay?" I said, "I am more than okay." She said, "Good, because I already booked my flight." The other 9 calls were variations on those 2. Some of the women had noticed and were confused and relieved to hear from me. Some had not noticed yet and were simply glad to confirm details. All of them, in one way or another, said something that made me understand why their names had been at the top of my list in the first place. Not because they said the right things about Linda or validated my response or told me I was justified, but because every single one of them, without exception, asked how I was doing before they asked anything else. That is the thing about the people who belong at your table. They ask about you first. I also want to tell you about Daniel's father, because I think he tends to get lost in these kinds of stories and he should not. Gerald Mercer is a quiet man in the way that certain men are quiet, not because they have nothing to say, but because they have learned that the things most worth saying are usually better received when they are offered sparingly. He knew about the venue change from Thursday evening, when Daniel told him, and his response had been to ask 2 practical questions about the new parking situation, and then say nothing further about the matter, which is how Gerald handles most things. On the morning of the wedding, he arrived at the new venue at 9:30, and found me in the hallway outside the bridal suite adjusting something on my grandmother's corsage. He stopped and looked at me for a moment in the way he sometimes does, a brief, thorough assessment, and then he said, "The venue is excellent. Your people are already here. You did the right thing." Then he went to find Daniel's uncle, and that was the entirety of his statement on 8 months of his wife's orchestration and the complete restructuring of a wedding he had helped fund. It was enough. More than enough. I think about Gerald sometimes when people ask me how Daniel turned out the way he did, given Linda. The answer is Gerald, who spent 34 years being quietly himself in a house that required a certain amount of management, and who somewhere along the way passed something essential to his son about the difference between what you say and what you do, and which one actually matters. There is one more thing I want to tell you about, and it is the thing I have never fully told anyone except Daniel, because it lives in the category of things that are true and important, but that I have not known how to say without sounding like something I'm not. In the week before the wedding, after the calls were made and the new venue was confirmed and the revised plan was fully operational, I had one night where I did not sleep. Not because I was anxious about the wedding. The wedding was handled. I did not sleep because I spent most of the night sitting at my kitchen table with the 2 spreadsheets side by side on my laptop screen, and I was thinking not about what Linda had done, but about the 8 months before it. The 8 months of warmth, the offered assistance, the way she had made herself indispensable to the planning in ways that felt like generosity and turned out to be access. I was thinking about the version of the wedding that would have happened if Jess had not called me. If the save the date had gotten lost in a spam folder or arrived late or been assumed to be a mistake. If I had gone into my wedding day not knowing, if I had stood at the altar, in front of a room full of people, half of whom I had chosen, and half of whom had been chosen for me, and never known the difference, and called it my wedding, that version of the day would have been real in every legal and practical sense. We would still have been married. The flowers would have been the same. The vows would have been the same. But there would have been 11 empty chairs in that room, 11 absences that looked like presences because they had been filled with substitutes, and I would not have known to grieve them. I am grateful to Jess for calling. I am grateful in a way that is hard to fully articulate, because what she gave me by calling was not just the knowledge of what Linda had done, it was the chance to choose my own wedding, to have it be actually mine. That is not a small thing. That is the whole thing. The women in that room on the day of my wedding were the women I chose. In the end, which is the only meaningful version of that sentence, some stories resolve themselves tidily and some do not, and I have made my peace with the fact that my relationship with Linda will never be what it might have been if the spreadsheet had stayed as I sent it. What I have instead is a marriage, and the right people in the photographs, and an office with good light, and Jess's laugh on the other end of the phone when I call, which is the same laugh it has always been, unchanged by any of it. And I have the memory of a parking lot in Austin on a November morning, a dark building, a note on a door, and a chair at the end of the front row with a small white card that said reserved, which no one sat in, which was always the point. If someone has been quietly rewriting your story and calling it help, you are allowed to take the pen back. You are allowed to change the address. The people who belong at your table will show up. The rest can find the note. Drop one word in the comments below. Just one word for how this story made you feel. Share it with someone who has been letting the wrong people manage their guest list. Hit subscribe and I will see you in the next one. 9 months after the wedding, I was hired to coordinate an event for a company whose founder I had met briefly at an industry conference. The event was a product launch, nothing unusual. The kind of work I do several times a year. During the initial planning call, the founder asked me how I handled situations where a client's internal stakeholders tried to revise the plan after it had been approved. I told her I kept meticulous records of every approved version of every document, and I made sure any revision request came through the official channel with explicit sign-off from the primary decision-maker before anything was changed. She said, "You sound like someone who learned it the hard way." I said, "I did." She said, "Good. The people who learn it the hard way are the ones who only have to learn it once." I thought about Linda when she said that. Not with anger. Not anymore. But with the particular clarity of someone who has processed a thing far enough to understand what it taught them. What Linda taught me is something I now apply professionally. Every time I hand a spreadsheet to someone who has offered to help, I send exactly the portion that is theirs to work with. And I keep the master document in a place only I can access, and I verify every external submission before it goes anywhere that matters. I am a better coordinator for what happened. I do not offer that as a silver lining because I do not think the people who wrong us are owed our gratitude for what we learn from it. I offer it simply as a fact. The knowledge lives in me now, and it costs nothing to carry, and it has protected things I care about more than once since that November morning. Daniel and Linda have a relationship. It is not the relationship Linda envisioned, the close, enmeshed dynamic she had managed with her son before I came along. But it is real in the ways that matter. He calls her on Sundays. We see her at holidays. She has learned to ask rather than arrange. Or at least she has learned to ask first and arrange later when she thinks no one is looking, which is a meaningful improvement over simply arranging. I have learned to keep better records. The farmhouse is still there, 30 minutes outside Austin. I drove past it once last spring on the way to an event I was scouting nearby. The parking lot was empty that afternoon, midweek off-season. I did not stop. I did not need to. Some places become part of your story not because of what happened in them, but because of what did not, and the farmhouse belongs to a wedding that was planned and then unmade and then made again somewhere better, by someone who had been underestimated and made one phone call. The chair at the end of the front row stayed in the photograph. Priya sent me the full set of her candid shots 3 weeks after the wedding, 247 photographs, and in one of them you can see it clearly, off to the left side of the frame while everyone in the foreground is watching the vows. The white card is visible. The chair is empty. The light in the room is exactly right. That photograph is not on my office wall. It is in a folder on my laptop labeled simply November, and I open it occasionally, not often, when I want to remember that the most important decisions I have ever made were not the dramatic ones but the quiet ones. The phone call to Susan at 8:15 in the morning, the 11 personal calls to the right people, the note on a door that said exactly what needed to be said and nothing more, the empty chair, the right room. My wedding?